Morning.
Morning. So I want to take a moment to reflect upon and feel the great burden and the great responsibility of the reality that Nebraska Zen Center, Bemis Park, Omaha, Nebraska, the state of Nebraska, the United States idea project was made possible by a genocide that continues to unfold. And that even if we're not participating, for a lot of us, it was done on our behalf without our permission. So while it might not be, we might not feel like it's our fault, it is our responsibility to bear that in mind and let that guide our sensitivity and practice. And to also respect the inheritance that we received from Jikai Dainin Daiyosho and the other teachers and priests that came from Japan. And in some cases leaving behind Japanese congregations in order to teach Zazen to people that didn't fit in at Japanese congregations and Japanese temples. You know, and to honor the particularities of that cultural legacy with humility and respect. So, humility and respect. I think I said I was going to talk about like ease and joy, right? What is? Who was? Yeah, ease and joy, something like that. And it's interesting how much humility and respect go along with ease and joy. So I was tenzo for quite a while at temples that fed kind of large amounts of people. Tenzo is the kitchen manager, the cook. And a lot of people arrive with cooking knowledge, but there's a distinction when you're going high volume. You know, when you're going high volume, there's little sweet eccentricities that you can do with home cooking that are a lot harder to do. You know, because when you are preparing 5 gallons of onions, you think of a 5-gallon bucket. Think you have to fill that with chopped onions. How you hold the knife all of a sudden matters more than the way you hold a knife when you cut 1 onion. You know, I think about my grandmother. My grandmother never used a cutting board. You know, she would always sit and use a little paring knife and cut things against her thumb. You know, and the cutting boards in my grandmother's house were called bread boards, and they slid out from under the counter. So if you tried to cut things on it, you're constantly putting tension on the bottom of the countertop, you know. And so people would come, and I'd have to train them on how to protect themselves, protect their bodies, and you know, the spirit of being efficient. And most people have this thing where if you give them an 8-inch chef's knife and they hold it, they put their finger across the top. This is a habit that folks seem to have a lot of the time. And if you're cooking at home, you can get away with it. If you're doing large volume cooking, it's weird. It's hard. It makes things harder. It's unnecessary. It puts weird strain. You're holding your wrist in a weird way when you're doing it like that. So I always told people, why don't you try going like that? Get that finger off there and hold it like this. You know? And you could choke up on it a little bit so that these 2 fingers and this thumb are actually on the metal part, not on the handle. You know? And that way, and I used to tell them, picture an old-timey like locomotive. You know, and you have those braces on those wheels, and this is called tip fulcrum. You keep the tip down and you're moving the arm like this. And so you're cutting. And for a lot of folks, there's this little dissonant moment when they're like, but no. But no, I hold it like this. It couldn't possibly matter that much, and I'm just going to keep doing it my way. You know? And that little urge, that sentiment, of kind of like, no, I think I'm going to keep doing it the way I've been doing it. You know, that's the heart of the beast right there, I think. How do you feel about where you are?
I can see you.
Okay, are you watching me on the Jumbotron?
Virtually.
Okay,
Yeah.
do you like that?
It's fine.
Okay. You know, why don't you not do that? Why don't you not do that? Why don't you do something new that's gonna feel confusing, but can over time engender greater ease? You know. So I don't know if you picked up, but I'm not necessarily just talking about knives right now, although this is good advice. Yeah. So the only reason I understand anything is secondarily because of my Zen teacher. I think if I would have exclusively taken my life's cues and my advice from my Zen teacher, I would have been in a lot worse shape than I am now. Luckily, I had other relationships. I had other relationships with people from marginalized communities that I wasn't a part of that were able to reflect something back to me that I didn't understand. You know, because the air that we breathe, the water that we swim in, the views that we have, we don't recognize it. We don't recognize our views as views. You know, we don't recognize our views as resultant of causes and conditions. A lot of the times, you know, and as they arise immediately. Usually it's like, well, reality is communicating to me directly and telling me what it is. And that's why I think this way. You know, it's clear as day that we shouldn't have the couch and the bookcase in the video. And for me, it's clear as day I should be centered. You know, it's clear as day you need to have a Doan behind that corner. It's clear as day, well, you can't stick someone behind the corner. You know, what's the causes and conditions? How come? So in our business of this practice, we're making the invisible visible of learning how our views are our points of view, and that they're the result of causes and conditions. And that's only possible when you can open the hand of thought and get non-protective. And you can only feel non-protective when you feel safe enough to be non-protective. So simultaneously, you're cultivating the conditions to be resourced enough to feel safe enough to be non-protective, and then to, and then to be brave enough to hear and respond to to the reality that's presenting itself to you. There's a koan, gosh, I forget the name of who it is. But what are the teachings of the Buddha? An appropriate response. Is an appropriate response creating a moat or a blockade around the views that I've ended up with? You know? Or is it feeling a flexibility around it? I was in a relationship once with someone that said, I have this friend that emigrated here from Africa. I forget where in Africa. And he wears a suit everywhere he goes. Isn't that cool? And I'm coming from my California, I'm into Zen because I'm radically unambitious, you know, kind of hippie trip or whatever. And I'm like, I mean, I guess that's fine if you want to be a suit, you know, if you want to be a square. And she's like, that's such a privileged position. And I'm like, my dad was a garbage man, you know. I'm running interference on that feedback. You know, how dare you? How dare you tell me that I availed myself to some kind of privilege that I don't think I did? How would I know? How would I know if I was privileged? You got to have that reflected back to you, and you got to feel resourced enough and safe enough to actually hear it without running interference and getting protective about it. You know, because I had a life where I didn't have to consider respectability. I was inherently respected. I was inherently taken seriously. I had to do so much less legwork to have people believe what I was saying than if I was, if I appeared female, if I was a person of color. It was so much easier for me. So I never had to consider, gosh, what kind of legwork do I have to do to be taken seriously in this world, and all the effort that that's going to take, And I regret to say that in that moment, this wasn't that long ago. This is 2019. And in that moment, in that relationship, I wasn't able to relinquish, that kind of idea that I'm not harboring any unseen predispositions here. I think about it. There was a time when Ed Sheeran and Beyonce were on a stage together to receive awards. And Beyonce was dressed like Beyonce. And Ed Sheeran was dressed like Ed Sheeran. And it was so dissonant. These are singers, if anyone. And Ed Sheeran's a singer from a white, red-haired kid from England who's a very sweet, gentle-hearted person. But he had, I think, like a long sleeve shirt with a different colored short sleeve shirt over it. He looked like he was on his way to class from his dorm or something like that. He was very floppy and disheveled, And it was an interesting juxtaposition. And we could look at that and be like, gosh, it's a shame that Beyonce feels like she has to do herself up like that, Rather than, oh gosh, it's a shame that Ed Sheeran can get away with making so little effort to be respectable. Right next to someone that has to put so much effort into being respectable. The other day, I study Tibetan Buddhism whenever I can. I think when it comes to somatics and attitude, I think Zen is in a good situation. When it comes to logic, philosophy, kind of intellectual understanding, I think Tibetan Buddhism's got kind of a leg up on us. We don't do so well with the philosophical aspect of Buddhism. So I study Tibetan Buddhism when I can, and there's this interesting. First thing that's interesting is that a lot of times when you're chanting in English translations of Tibetan texts, they call Buddha the victorious one and the heroic one and the foe destroyer, which is interesting.
The what destroyer?
The foe destroyer.
Foe?
Yeah, like F-O-E.
Oh, foe.
Yeah, like a foe.
Okay.
Yeah, not like noodle soup. Yeah. But what's heroic? What's victorious? How do you become victorious as a meditator? What's the attitude of victory? And is our understanding of what foe destroying and victorious and heroic is, what's coloring that for us? Is it who? Is it Luke Skywalker? Is it General Patton? Is it something less violent? Is it something more humble? Can you be humble and be victorious? Can you be open and receptive and have an appropriate response? And is that victorious and foe destroying and heroic? But anyway, so we're a lot of times when you study with a kind of traditional school of Buddhism, they're kind of presenting you with their own orthodoxy, and there's kinds of ideas that don't match with what the scholastic historical understanding is. So if you're studying with Tibetan Buddhists, sometimes they'll be like, well, Buddha taught Tantra, but it was secret because it wasn't there. There were select few people that were advanced enough to understand that. So it was, he hid it. They call them termas. He hid it in rocks to be unleashed by the correct person, and then these revealed teachings come forth. And sometimes you're studying Tibetan, and they're like, "This text was written by Maitreya." I'm like, Maitreya? You know, the Buddha of future birth. You know, there's a text called, I think, the Sublime Continuum, which is attributed to Maitreya. And I'm like, Maitreya is the Buddha of future birth. How can we attribute a text to Maitreya? And so my kind of attitude is formed by like, that's not historical. I wish they would at least, and I'm telling my partner, I wish they would at least contextualize this by saying, here's what the tradition says, but here's what really happened, you know? And my partner, I mentioned this yesterday in our class, I said, my partner kind of looked at me with a little disappointment and a little disgust and said, are you like a scientific materialist? And I'm like, no. I'm open to things beyond the scene. You know, I'm a priest of a mystical religion. You know, and but I mean, come on. You know, and they're kind of like, and they come from a background that is their father's from India, and their mother's Sami, which is the indigenous Finnish, like the reindeer people, you know, that live near the North Pole. And they had, from both sides, a kind of shamanic training and upbringing. Like, since they were born, it's kind of like, you know, their dad, who's like a very, very sober engineer, is like, yeah, there's this gift that runs in our family, you know, you have it, and then you can, you know, my sister had it, blah, blah, and, you know, so my partner's like, so when I talk about that stuff, do you think I'm lying? You know, when I talk about having witnessed people being able to pull sickness out of each other, you know? And I'm like, no, I don't think you're lying. But I think it's, and then I'm kind of stumped. You know, I get to a point where like, no, I don't think you're lying. But then there's a subtext there, but it's like, but I think it's different than what you're saying. You know? And then I had to like look at that squarely. I'm like, okay, there's hubris here. I have an inherited cultural predisposition that I've actually been trying to like break free of since I was 20, you know, and I'm unwilling to consider like, how open is your heart to the idea that there's this world of real things happening that you're not privy to, you know? And like, and the reason I'm talking about this isn't to try to make a pitch for shamanism or something like that, but or like spirit work or ancestor work or you know, magic. Although I'm warming up to it personally, but that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is with that person in that moment, I was able to do what I couldn't quite do years earlier when I was being called out for my privilege of kind of poo-pooing the idea of wearing a suit. You know, I felt safe enough. The groundwork had been established. There was trust in that relationship. I knew no one was out to get me. You know? And I felt safe enough to be like, gosh, yeah, I guess I have this, you know, implicit bias, this invisible bias against believing in that. And I really wish I didn't. I really wish I was open to the totality of the possibility of the world, you know? And I don't know if it seems related, but I think it's related to, why don't you not do that? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do what's less strenuous? You know, less strenuous, the less strenuous option of, what did Dogen Zenji say? Carrying the self forward. You know? What is the emotional, what is the somatic sense that you have when you think of carrying yourself forward? In a way, it feels empowering, emboldening. There's energy there. I'm carrying myself forward. You know, carpe diem. I'm gonna meet the world. You know? But what is this self I'm carrying forward? You know, and how fortified does it need to be? Suzuki Roshi in, I believe, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, said, this thing that we call I is just a swinging door that the breath goes through, one direction.
That's in Zen Mind Beginner's.
Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind.
Yes.
It's a swinging door, the breath goes through, it goes one direction and it goes the other direction. But where's the I? And when you study early Buddhism, when you study the aggregates, Buddha said, if you seize upon this body and think, this body is me, or I have a body, and then that body changes, it causes vexation, it causes lamentation, it causes grief. You know? If you seize on a view, if you seize on a sense of self, and think, that self is me, or I have that self, and that self changes, it causes grief, it causes lamentation. So the idea here is, how do I hold my relationship to myself that lets it be as fluid as it actually is, so that I'm not trying to live a life that's not possible to live? This is Buddha's big deal. He's like, the life you're trying to live has never been possible, of carrying the self forward. You know, when we talk about emptiness, empty of what? Empty of the imagined. Empty of the imputation that's been put on something that is so much more dynamic than what we're naming it. So right now, I just drove here, and usually when I come in the future, so I'm going to come 6 times this year, and when I come in the future, I intend to linger a little bit so that I could, be around if anyone wants to talk to me or whatever. But this weekend, I apologize, I'm not lingering because the United States declared war on my city. And I have a trans brown partner that needs a chaperone everywhere they go. And we put a patch on their shoulder, on their parka, that says injured shoulder, please be careful. Because we don't know. Imagine what that's like, pinning that on your loved one's jacket, because you don't know if they're going to get yanked going through a walk in the city that they were born in and grew up in. And when I look at the confrontations between ICE and the residents of Minnesota who want to protect their neighbors, I have that thought, why, what would it be if these aggressors stopped carrying themselves forward? What if you stop doing that, which causes strain, and start doing this? What's the cause of happiness? When we're carrying ourselves forward, when we're fortifying the self, when we're protecting, when we're running interference, when we're having that conversation where it's like, that's not what I am. Instead of being receptive, is that receptivity a weakening or a strengthening? Is that yielding a weakening or a strengthening? Is that appropriate response, taking something away or giving something to yourself? In addition to being Katagiri Roshi's birthday, it's also the time of the year in the Pure Land sect in Japan, in the Jodo Shinshu sect, sometimes called Shin sect or Shin Buddhism, that they honor their founder, Shinran Shonin. In fact, right now, the Twin Cities Pure Land Sangha is having a ceremony for Shinran Shonin. Shinran Shonin was a contemporary of Dogen Zenji. So he lived in the same time, almost exactly the same age, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure. And they found an old map of Kyoto, and apparently they lived kind of across the street from each other in the capital at one point. And basically, as soon as you leave Kyoto Station, if you start walking, I think, north, you go through in between this big temple complex called Honganji. And that's where it started as Shinran's burial site, mausoleum, and that became I think one of the largest temples in Japan. I think it might be the largest wooden structure in Japan. Anyway, Shinran Shonin's big thing was he practiced at the same monastery as Dogen Zenji, Engakuji, Enrakuji, sorry, not Engakuji, Enrakuji on Mount Hiei, which is the headquarters of the Tendai sect, which was kind of that was the Vatican of Japan during that period, and they kind of had a monopoly, you know. And he practiced there, and at a certain point, he was just like, all of this trying seems to be pushing it all away. I'm paraphrasing here. This isn't verbatim, you know. In fact, you can watch this little cartoon that's for free on the internet about the life of Shinran Shonin, and he's talking to I think his grandchildren or neighborhood children, and he points at the mountains. He's like, I lived there when I was young. I used to think that effort would cause enlightenment. And then the little kids go, is it wrong to train? And then he kind of goes, well, it's complicated, you know, something like that, you know. But the sect that he found was kind of like, don't do anything calculating, you know, abandon the calculating mind, and let your practice be an expression of gratitude for being endowed with awakening from the get-go. And so you're opening to, this is a very big thing in East Asian Buddhism. Everybody kind of relates to it in a different way, but this idea of hongaku, which means original awakening. You know, instead of trying to uncover your awakening by getting rid of all the fetters, just you stop adding them. Stop adding the fetters. You know, so sometimes I talk about this. I say, instead of you minus your delusions is awake, you plus 0 is awake. And the practice is, how do you manifest the plus 0? So in the Pure Land school, it's kind of considered naughty to meditate, because that's calculation. You know, it's carrying the self forward. And so their practice is to chant the name of the Buddha, not because it's a meditation, not because it gives you samadhi or quiets the mind, but because you're expressing gratitude for being born a Buddha. And if you read, there's a text, a short essay written by Taigen Dan Layton, who now lives, I think, in Colorado. No, not Colorado, the other C, Chicago. I get my words that start with C and end with O mixed up. And he wrote this text kind of saying, like, we can look at that and think of that as, like, you know, if you're coming from a Eurocentric, Euro-American-centric background, you can think, gosh, that sounds like Christianity, you know, to just pray, you know, and think that you'll be, like, reborn in a Pure Land if you pray enough or something like that. But Taigen Roshi says, Dogen's not so far off from that, Dogen Zenji. Because if you look at the way Shikantaza is presented in the Soto Zen sect, it's just kind of like, just throw yourself into the house of the Buddha. You know, and let Buddha take care of it. You know, sit upright without a calculating mind. You know, the lay teacher and astrologer from 20th century Japan, Bokoto Ikebe, she gave my favorite one-line description of Zazen. Sit upright, let delusion be. Not carrying the self forward. So what does Dogen Zenji say after not carrying the self forward? You know, to carry yourself forward is delusion. That myriad things come forth. No, what does he say? Just come help me out. To carry yourself forward and experience the self. No, is it
10,000.
10,000.
No, we're not at 10,000 things yet. No, yeah, we might be. To carry, gosh, I used to know this. To carry the self forward and experience myriad things is delusion. Yes, myriad things. Okay. To carry the self forward and experience myriad things is delusion, and that myriad things come forth and illuminate the self is awakening. You know. So when I'm in that moment, when my partner's saying to me, like, do you think I'm lying? Or they're saying to me, do you see that your positionality and that your conditioning has led you to the belief that, like, it's unnecessary or adventitious to engage in wearing a suit for respectability, you know, in the relative world, you know, like what you think of what life is like is not what life is like for all beings, you know, and we walk around kind of thinking everybody's us, because it's our only point of reference. Yeah. So when I respond to that, instead of trying to protect my image, my self-image as just and fair and understanding all things, and I get to just drop away, body and mind, just relax that, you know, instead of holding like that, just take that finger off the top of the knife, you know, and not treat it as a confrontation, treat it as this opportunity to pivot towards a receptive, gentle heart that can take direction, that can find new truths, you know, new truths that don't bear down on me so much. And to feel safe and resourced enough to let yourself become someone new, because you're going to anyway. You know, it's like that teaching about the skandhas. If we think that self is me, or that I possess the self, and that self changes, it's going to cause vexation. You know, so we're becoming beings with very smooth, slick, slippery guts. You know, because my teacher used to say, when you start carrying the self forward, it manifests a constriction somewhere in the body. So the way that Zazen can work somatically is to try to manifest non-constriction. And you can be manifesting freedom from carrying the self forward. Letting that breath come in, letting that breath come out, and being open to the stretching, to the silkiness of the felt experience of just existing. You know, to let it be silky. My Tibetan teacher says, let the self be as shaggy as it is. Because apparently in Tibet and Nepal, people decorate their yaks. And if you don't decorate a yak, you say, you're letting it be shaggy as it is. You know, let the mind be shaggy as it is. You know, we're not trying to present something that is beyond reproach. You know, my first Zen teacher, my only Zen teacher, my main Zen teacher, who some of you may know, Kosho. He lived here for a little while. Kosho went to seminary, and he did 20 years as an Episcopal priest. And he said the training at seminary was to be beyond reproach, which means that no one can find fault in you, to become such a one that no one can find fault in you. You know, I would say the training in Zen is to be happy to find fault and pivot. You know, welcome the fault. And what would it be like to have it not be bad news? You know, I remember when I was working I worked at a big record store on Haight Street called Amoeba Music. It used to be a bowling alley. It still says bowling alley on it, I think. I remember I'm like 20 years old, and everybody's talking about music all the time, and it was like kind of like a, you know, a snobby, eccentric, bohemian, like nerds kind of place to be. And I remember there was a day when I realized, after faking it, that if someone's talking about a band I've never heard of, I can say so. It took me quite a while to be willing to say I've never heard of that band in that environment, because I wanted them to like me and know that I'm good, you know? And it's just like, well, what if I didn't? You know, what if I say, oh, I don't know what that is? You know, what if when someone says, yeah, that's a privileged position, I go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. I could see that. Gosh, I should probably adjust. What if someone says, are you like a scientific materialist? Yeah, that's an invisible view that I've been carrying around and harboring, and it's not really fair, I don't think. It's not quite where I want to be. You know, I want to be open to magic. Because there's a part of me that believes in it, and there's a part of me that's running interference. You know? Because of the invisible sea that I've been swimming in all of my life. and the way that it's perfumed my views. Yeah. So it's tricky. It's a tricky leap to make, because it's like one of the analogies that we use in this tradition is, or in the early Buddhist tradition, is it's like a frog describing dry land to a fish. It sounds like nowhere. It sounds like nowhere you want to be, not carrying the self forward. But it unlocks this like limitless safety. It's a safe place to be, because you can't be assailed, because there's no self to be harmed. You know, I think Socrates said that. He said, if you're really good, it's hard to harm you. You know, well, I don't know what good means, but if you're not trying to carry the self forward, you can't. You know, when I think about, you know, I grew up in a high school that was kind of rough. Well, I didn't grow up in a high school, but I spent time at a high school while I was growing up. And to think and to watch so many conflicts unfold. You know, to watch so many guys get in fights, you know. And to think, what would it be like if someone said, those are cheap shoes, you got Mervyn's shoes or whatever. And you go, yeah, I got Mervyn's shoes, they're cheap shoes. My family's poor. You know? Where'd it go? You know, where did the animosity go? You know, where does the conflict go? You know? Now, there's a shadow side of this that needs to be mentioned. You know, because when we get into Buddhist spaces, we get into spiritual spaces, and someone starts saying, "Well, just let go of your stories," then we start to get dangerously close. The near enemy of not protecting the self is throwing the self under the bus, gaslighting yourself. I have some friends that in the Twin Cities that had early experiences with teachers where the teacher kind of made an assessment about their character that was bullshit, you know, and kind of unfair, and just coming from, you know, it could be from anything. It could be from that person's mood that day. It could be from, you know, I trained with Sasaki Roshi, who never named an heir. And so for some teachers, like this point of pride that they never name an heir, and it's like, I mean, you must be a bad teacher. You can't communicate this well enough to somebody that they're an heir, right? You know, you had 20 years to make an heir, and you know, I could teach someone this stuff in 20 years. Anyway, but none of you are good enough. It's like, maybe it's not us.
Yeah.
And what was the point? And when I was watching Sasaki Roshi, and I would go in for they called it sanzen, and you working with koans in the Rinzai tradition. I'm like, he's looking for himself. You know, I don't know if that's true or not, but this is my imputation. This is what I think. I think he's looking for himself, and until he sees himself, he's not going to be satisfied, and no one's going to be himself. You know, I think this is a dangerous thing with koan study. You know, someone wants you to express it the way that they understand it. And it doesn't have to be the way that they understand it for it to be right, for it to be appropriate response. You know? And so I know people that, you know, I know someone that in the 80s asked Katagiri Roshi, you know, I want to become a priest. He goes, no, I don't think you, not yet. You know? And harbored that for like a decade. I'm not good. Roshi said I'm not good enough. Roshi said it's not right for me. You know, and to have the safety and to, you know, that in a way, it's the mirror image of carrying the self forward, but it's still centered around the self. It's still not fluid. You know, to harbor and internalize a negative self-image or something like that, or harbor and internalize something that's giving you the short end of the stick. You know, so sometimes we say, like in the Bible, I think, like treat others like you would treat yourself, or that you want to be treated. You know, but I think it's tricky in our society because a lot of us are kind of grow up trained to like think we're not so great. You know, so I would think maybe treat yourself like you would treat others. Because sometimes we're a lot worse to ourselves than we are to others. You know, so how would you talk to yourself if you weren't you? You know, sometimes I have to run myself through this. I'm like, how would I give myself advice if I weren't me? Because I know I'm bad, but I want other people to be happy. You know, so how would I talk to myself if I was somebody that I wanted to find their happiness, find their autonomy, find their freedom, you know, avail themselves to what they're interested in pursuing in life? You know, how would I talk to myself then, rather than, you know, just being a repository for all the negativity that I've received from beginning this time. So this freedom goes both ways. You know, it's not talking us out of views, but it's giving us an option to be really, really honest. You know, and when you're not carrying the self forward, like the Tenzo said to Dogen Zenji, nothing is hidden. It's easier to identify reality because you're not asking yourself, what does this mean to me all the time? Yeah. Sometimes you got to do that. Sometimes you're in the temple environment, and especially like at a residential temple, you have kind of like, what's the word? Conflicts of interest. You know, someone will come to you and be like, I really want to go pursue, you know, a career in counseling psychology, you know, and I, as a teacher that wants that person to have full development, full fruition of all their potential and who they are, and have them find freedom and satisfaction in life, you know, it's clear to me, I'm like, yeah, I think that's a great idea. You should probably go do that. But if I'm thinking, well, then who's going to be the guest manager? You know, if I'm not carrying the self forward and not thinking, how does this impact me? Then I can be generous.